me when I go live. We're live. Okay.
Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine for today's talk, Union Naval Medicine with Dr. Mick Bedard. Programs like this are made possible by members. If you aren't a member, please consider becoming one. Not only is it the best way to support us, but you get some great benefits as well. Complimentary subscriptions to our journal and newsletter, 10% off in the gift shop, free admission, and your admission today can be put towards a membership by the end of the day. So give that a thought. Before I introduce today's speaker, quick reminder that this is an educational program. Please do not take what we say here as medical advice. Dr. Mick Bedard, however, is a medical professional. He's a graduate of Brown University and the University of Cincinnati Medical School. Dr. Bedard is board certified in internal medicine and allergy and immunology. Now retired, Dr. Bedard lives in Alexandria, Virginia. He has more accomplishments that I can sum up right here, but he is uniquely positioned to talk about Civil War history and medical history, both as a medical professional and a Civil War enthusiast. Dr. Bedard is currently the treasurer of the Civil War Roundtable of DC and is an active member in the naval reenactment group, the Kearsarge Afterguard, where he portrays an acting assistant surgeon. So please join me in welcoming a man uniquely positioned to discuss this history, Dr. Mick Bedard.
Thank you, Kyle. You haven't talked to my wife about my accomplishments. It's a pleasure to give a talk here at the Civil War Medical Museum. I've been an off and on member for decades, and it is payback to Dr. Gordon Dahman for his kind talk to the Madison Civil War Roundtable in Wisconsin back in 1978 that he did as a courtesy for me. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to meet him here, but his spirit, his equipment, his collection is the basis on which this grand museum has been founded. So with that, thank you to Kyle and the staff. We will start. As Kyle said, my interest in Civil War began probably in 1958 when the centennial was starting, and I've maintained it through my life. It's much easier to portray a naval surgeon than a Union infantryman, let me tell you. Well, the topics that I'll cover today is the role of the Navy, the Union Navy in the American Civil War, and the role of doctors, caregivers within that expanding Union Navy. With the onset of the Civil War, General Scott, along with Lincoln, agreed that one strategic aim would be to blockade the South, to strangle it from supply and export. And they came up with the Anaconda Plan, and that would entail the Union Navy blockading the 7 to 8 major ports of the South, taking local coastal installations back, and blockading as many of the many inlets, bays, rivers that coursed into the ocean as they could. It was a real task that Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, put his immense energy and expertise into. Lincoln called him, nicknamed Father Neptune, and he was ably served by the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Gustavus Fox. The Union Navy at the onset of the Civil War was very small. 48 ships were up on blocks, and most of the ships were not steam driven. Of the 1,200 officers, a quarter of them resigned their commissions and went south. And the sailors, about 7,500. And within the 4 years of the Civil War, the Navy would expand nearly 7 times in number of ships, 7 times in number of officers, and 7 times in number of sailors and Marines. Its tasks were innumerable. It had to form up blockading squadrons for the North and South Atlantic and the East and West Gulf. It had to protect the lines of communications up and down the Potomac because the eastern Maryland shore was strongly Southern in its sympathy, as was parts of the southern shore. It had to assist the Army in moving up and down the Mississippi and tributaries. The Army controlled a number of ironclads early in the war and then gave them up to Navy control in 1862. And not only did it have to deal with the Civil War in America, it had to deal with Confederate raiders that were preying on whalers and U.S. merchantmen all over the world, as far north as the Bering Sea, and still maintain diplomatic relationships with countries such as the Shogunate Japan and the west coast of South America. Well, with the expansion, technology changes also occurred. So on March 8, 1862, a new era of naval warfare began. The Confederates had modified the USS Merrimack into the CSS Virginia and sortied it out of Norfolk to challenge the Union blockade of the James River. The Virginia rammed under heavy fire and sank the USS Cumberland, an all-sail frigate. It fired on and then set fire to the USS Congress, sinking that. So on that day, the blockade is in jeopardy. If the Confederates can break the blockade, they might be able to engineer recognition by France and England, hugely complicating the war. But in the nick of time, the USS Monitor arrives from its build out in New York. An Erickson, uniquely designed Erickson Monitor, arrives just in time to challenge the CSS Virginia. And the age of the wooden warship, the all-sail warship, is over. And a picture of that duel, which would end up in a draw or a strategic Union win between the Monitor, the Merrimack, or the Monitor and the Virginia. Enter my protagonist, Charles Ellery Stedman, MD. He is offered his services to the Union Navy out of Boston. He's a double legacy doctor. His father and grandfather were doctors. He was born himself in the U.S. Naval Hospital in Boston. He is a double Crimson, Harvard, 1852, and an MD from Harvard in 1855. He's not without some maritime experience in that he made several trips as a passenger liner ship surgeon back and forth from Boston to Great Britain. He's an amateur artist. He's done an artwork of his experience being a yachtist. Dr. Hardlee spends a fortune on a yacht. His sketches of his experiences owning a sailboat. He's a cousin to Winslow Homer. During his service with 3 U.S. ships and at the Naval Hospital in Boston, he did sketches for personal consumption only. And after the war would flesh that out into a book that he called Dr. Squilgee's 4 Years in the Navy. And we'll talk about what a squilgee is. He had duty on different types of Union warships and shore duty at the Naval Hospital where he had been born and where his father had been head. This is the title page of Dr. Squilgee's 4 Years in the Navy. A squilgee is a squeegee. In the morning, the soldiers will wash and scrub the decks, and to get the excess water off the decks, they'll use this device called a squilgee as a squeegee. Officer on deck. And he's got his crest of arms with his shoulder tabs, his officer's sword, his amputation knife, a jar of blue mass or heavy metal, and pictures of a sailor in sickbay, a sailor sleeping it off. Compare that to his cousin's early work. This is Winslow Homer, who was doing sketching for illustrated magazines and doing early watercolors during his attachment to the Army of the Potomac in 1862, 1863. I have not put up one of Winslow Homer's more mature works, but you can get a sense that Winslow Homer chose the right profession, and after the war, Dr. Stedman stayed in the right profession. His sketches are good. They border on cartoons at times, but there's still a lot of information we can glean out of them. This is his sketch of Dr. Stedman sitting for an examination with the medical board for the Navy. The Navy was very traditional, very set in his ways, and had rigorous examinations of prospective surgeons. And he often playfully changes the names to protect the innocent, if you will, of who he's making drawings of. And he has Dr. Weatherly, Dr. Bilger, and Dr. Tompkin, all variations on a naval theme. And these examinations would be 3 days long and quite rigorous and encompass not only anatomy, physiology, treatments, medication, also history, classics, literature, geography. He passed and was assigned to the USS Huron. This is not a picture of the sailors of the USS Huron. This is a picture taken on the afterdeck of the USS Miami. And it just gives you an idea of what his subjects, what his patients are going to be like. And as opposed to the Union Army, where the average age is about 18 to 19, the average age of the sailors is appreciably older, 24, 25. They were often from the cities of the North, New York, Boston, Philly, Annapolis, Cincinnati. They often had a trade or were beginning a trade as they entered into the Navy. Some had experience as in the maritime industry. Beginning of the war, about 5% are African American, and as men present self-emancipated, offering their services. They're enlisted into the Union Navy as landsmen. Some achieve significant rank. If I can get it here. Here, this sailor right here, he's got insignia as a gunner's mate, and he's looking over his gun. Do not tamper with this gun. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble with him. And these sailors are at their leisure, some doing their sewing, this Marine playing banjo, checkers. There's another game going on here, all under the supervision of the deck officer. Many of these sailors living in cities, had had childhood illnesses, unlike the young soldiers going into camps of instruction. Juxtapose the 7th Vermont goes into camp of instruction in St. Johnsbury with 1,000 men, and within 6 weeks, 700 are down with measles. So many of these sailors have had those childhood illnesses, and thus not encumbering the sick rolls with those conditions. These are the officers who would be supervising the sailors. These are deck officers of the USS Mendota. They are considered gentlemen. Some are U.S. Naval Annapolis Academy grads. Some have been in the maritime trades as acting masters. And as the Union Navy expanded, there was more and more brought in from the other maritime trades, whaling, merchant fishing, brought in to become deck officers. And there was a distinction as the Union Navy became more and more steam-powered. There were engineering officers, and they were not considered gentlemen. So they would have a separate mess and separate servants to the deck officers. Stedman's first posting is to this ship, the USS Huron, that he nicknames it the USS 4 knots as to how fast it can go. It is built out in Boston in 90 days. It is, Stedman considered it not very seaworthy. It rolled heavily in the sea. And it was used for blockade duty along the southern coast. Here he is being introduced to Captain Rum below. It's Captain Downs of the USS Huron. And he would follow Captain Downs into the next, to Captain Downs' next command. So he's being introduced, brought up by the officer at the deck, and it being introduced to Captain Rumbelow. I'm sure he kept this name away from Captain Downs because one could be, considered glib and insubordinate. But when I look at his prints, his sketches, the foreground characters are usually better drawn than the background characters. The background characters border almost into a cartoon. His sailors all have that Popeye look. The huge forearms, the narrow waist, the huge thighs. Part of my talk is to make the distinction between naval medicine and Union Army medicine, and this is the first distinction. That even though Stedman has had maritime experience going back and forth to Europe as a passenger liner. He still got seasick. And this says here, wishes, here we go, wishes he had joined the Army. So first distinction, you're going to get seasick. Most people. And the derivation of nausea is from the Greek word for ship. N-A-W, is nausea, the derivative for nausea. In terms of medications that he might have used, and here I'll deny that I gave you this information and don't use it at home, but some things that he might have used to treat his nausea is a wine glass of brandy or 10 to 40 drops of laudanum. Creosote, 1 drop at a dose made into a pill. Creosote is like wood preservative. 10 drops of hartshorn in a half a tumbler of water, or chloroform, 40 to 80 drops suspended in water by means of a little gum arabic. Now, the fact that there are so many remedies for seasickness tells you that none are damn good. So don't try any of these at home, please. Well, to expand on medicines, the medicines used in the Navy are similar to the medicines used in the Army. Very few are effective in our modern sense or modern knowledge, and most had a basis on the humoral theory of disease. And there's a nice poster in this gallery over here about humors. You balanced humors. If a person had a fever and was red and their pulse was bounding, it would appear that they had too much blood, so they would be cupped or bled in the old Galen humoral theory of treatments. There were some that were effective, certainly the anesthetics, the opiates for pain, diarrhea, nausea, quinine and cinchona or Peruvian bark for malaria. But some were downright toxic, doing more harm than good, particularly the heavy metal salts. Stedman trained at Harvard, probably took lectures from Oliver Winslow Holmes, Sr., the poet of the Old Ironsides and professor of medicine at Harvard. And that professor was quoted as saying you could throw the whole supply table, in other words, all the medicines that the doctors have, into the ocean to the detriment of the fishes and to the benefit of mankind. So even that doctor and many doctors were beginning to question the heroic treatments, bleeding, cupping, purging, treatment with heavy metal salts. Illnesses aboard, much the same as a regimental surgeon would see, particularly the acute and chronic diarrhea. Certainly the incidence of acute diarrhea is lower in the Navy, but they would also see malaria and then sometimes yellow fever, particularly in the fall, cruising the Caribbean. They would see the childhood exanthems, measles, mumps, smallpox, chickenpox, erysipelas, scarlet fever, and also the colds, catarrhs, flus. Wound infections, sailors are always cutting themselves, abrasions from ropes, chafing from improperly cleaned clothes because of the salt water. And then in long cruises, they might see scurvy, rare, but occasionally seen. And sailors being sailors, venereal disease, prostatitis, and many would unfortunately have melancholia or nostalgia or depressions, alcoholism, and boredom. Fine picture of measles and scarlet fever. Again, less incidents in the Navy. Now, cleanliness is next to godliness to some degree, at least for sailors, maybe. When they had tropical downpours, they would take the opportunity to do the laundry because it's difficult to clean clothes with saltwater soaps and in salt water. So they would try to use God's gift of fresh rainwater to replenish the water stores and to do laundry. There was a major change in the Navy in September 1862. Spirit rations were common in the American Navy from the time it was formed, a tradition taken over from the British Navy. Old grog was Admiral Vernon. Admiral Vernon, George Washington's brother, named Mount Vernon after Admiral Vernon because that brother served with Old Grog in the Caribbean. General Washington inherited the estate after his brother died. So there was a push to bring on prohibition on U.S. Navy ships. Initially, the grog ration was rum, but as western districts, western Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Kentucky, politically became more important, they switched to whiskeys. But by the time of August 1862, Congress prohibited the spirit ration aboard U.S. naval ships. And these are the sailors, alas, taking their last grog ration. A grog ration would occur twice a day and would be the equivalent of 2 ounces of hard alcohol. If you were a teetotaler, you would get 5 cents in lieu of your ration. And it was heavily supervised because they did not want the sailors to surreptitiously hide their ration and drink it later. But sailors being sailors will find alcohol where and when they can. Bumboats bringing out supplies would surreptitiously sneak alcohol aboard. But this sailor is coming back from shore leave, and it says, justly incensed commander to the Liberty man returning. Hi there, come here, you sir. What's your name? Name, Lord bless you. I ain't got any name. It was shot away at Mobile Bay. You can see the other officers snickering, recognizing that this sailor's headed to the brig for bread and water and to sober up. Tensions were reduced on board by skylarking. At a watch change, the dog watch change, where sailors would be on for 2 hours and then off for 2 hours, the off-duty sailors would be able to cavort, wrestle, dance, sing, do whatever they wished, smoke. And this is the sailors skylarking. Well, what is a threat to a sailor aboard a ship? Drowning, tackle falling, spars falling, ropes falling, certainly cuts because every sailor would have a blunt-tipped knife. Burns, scalding, particularly in the engineering spaces. And then in battle, wounds from bullet, shot, shell, bolt, nut, and wood splinter, and then exhaustion. This is Stedman. We think Stedman resetting a dislocated shoulder in a sailor who's fallen during the gale. And his technique is much the same as orthopedic doctors will do now. Tension, downward tension on the limb, inward rotation, and it would pop back in. Stedman's second posting is to the USS Nahant, which is a next generation monitor, Erickson design monitor. This was built in Boston. Now, this picture of the Nahant is in Spanish-American War colors, or it's picture done during the Spanish-American War. I could not find a period picture, Civil War period picture of the Nahant. But it has 2 guns and a movable turret with a pilot house under that canopy on top of the turret. It's of the Passaic class, a number of different sister ships, and this is a picture of the USS Lehigh, a sister ship to the Nahant during the Civil War, and gives you an idea what the Nahant would look like in 1862, 63, 64, 65. The pilot house is up here. Got a smokestack, the removing turret, and there's about 15 inches of iron on the sides, about 11 inches of iron on the deck, and about 8 inches of iron for the pilot house. And about 12 feet of draft. These were not very well designed for ocean going, but they were pretty good for the sounds and deep rivers of the South. And that is all around a steam engine and coal-fired furnaces generating lots of heat. So these, in the summer heat in the South, with the engines going, the boiler rooms, the engineering spaces, the temperatures could rise as much to 140 degrees. So fatigue and exhaustion among the firemen, the coal heavers, the mechanics was very high. And even the officers in their wardroom could be affected by the heat. And this is Stedman saying the pleasures of letter writing at 90 degrees Mercury in the officer's wardroom. Exhaustion, heat exhaustion, boredom took a great toll on sailors' health, and many a sailor officer had to be medically surveyed and then sent back to a naval hospital for recovery. The USS Nahant, along with 6 of his sister ships, six monitors, along with the new Ironsides. The new Ironsides here, and the double monitor USS Keokuk, I'm not sure I got that name right, participated on April 7th, 1863, with a bombardment of the Charleston forts, Sumter, Moultrie, Battery Pinckney, the battery at Charleston Harbor, Fort Wagner, and they took on the Charleston forts and got hammered by the counterfire. One there was one casualty, and no, excuse me, one death and 25 wounded among this flotilla, but they were shot at by over 400 Confederate shells. The Nahant got off 36 rounds, no, excuse me, got off 11 rounds and was hit 36 times. Now, aboard the Nahant is Alva Hunter, and this is where you get collaboration. Alva Hunter was a ship's boy, signed on with Stedman in Boston at the commissioning of the Nahant. And he kept a diary and wrote an account of his year on a monitor after the war. And he gives this account. Just after we came under terrific fire which rained down on us, 3 heavy shots struck the pilot house in quick succession. The pilot house is that small cylindrical object on top of the turret, and in it would be the captain, the quartermaster, and the helmsman. One of these shots struck just at the base of the pilot house where there was a massive iron ring which rested atop the turret. The metal of this iron ring bulged outward and upward, and inch-thick plates of the pilot house were bulged outward and downward around a deep dent made by the shot. As a result, the turret and the pilot house were welded together. At almost the same instant, a shot struck the pilot house close beside one of the peepholes. The bolts which held the inch plates together were countersinked into the plates on the outside, with nuts being on the inside. The shot hitting a bolt knocks a nut loose. And one of the bolts broke off and ricocheted within the pilot house. Quartermaster Cobb was at the wheel. Pilot Sofield stood a little behind him and was stooping over a bit to observe what he could through the peephole. And Captain Downs was standing a little bit to the side of the pilot. The flying nut struck Cobb on the side of his forehead, tearing off a piece of his skull about 5 inches long and 3 wide, inflicting a mortal wound. It then struck Pilot Sofield close to the spinal column at the base of the neck, making a deep cut nearly 2 inches in length and affecting paralysis of the body because of the shock to the nerves. So they dropped as almost instantly killed. It then glanced downward and struck upward and struck the top of the pilot house, then rebounded downward upon Captain Downs' foot, inflicting a painful bruise that kept the captain limping about with the age of a stout cane for several days. We in the berth deck knew nothing of this tragedy until the turret chamber door opened and three men came through bearing the body of poor Cobb. And it was the my first sight of a wounded man. For a few seconds, I wished I was back in Boston. So I recommend this book. It's got a nice introduction by an Annapolis history professor, Craig Simmons, and it's by South Carolina Press. So the Nahant came within 500 yards of Fort Sumter and sustained 31 hits and 1 dead and 12 wounded. There's a picture of what it would be like within the turret, which would have 2 guns, 11-inch smoothbores in the Nahant. and the powder division, which would be one deck below, where they would bring the shell or the cannonballs and the powder up to a hoist to raise up to the turret deck. I don't know how, these cannonballs are about 400 pounds each, and I'm skeptical that that one sailor could move that ball, particularly in bare feet. What would happen if a sailor was hit by a splinter, a piece of iron, or a cannonball? And this is out of the medical surgical history of the Civil War. It's a picture of an unfortunate soldier of the 100th Pennsylvania who had a severe fracture, traumatic amputation, if you will, of his lower leg. Where would the surgeon be? Surgeon would be in the wardroom, which would be the sick bay during a combat. And this is a fanciful rendition by Stedman. The 4 knots was not in a major engagement, so he's doing make-believe with this sketch, but still it gives you an idea of what would be happening in a wardroom under fire. Chloroform or ether being provided. Here we go. Provided for an amputation being done here. Sailors being dressed, sailors being brought in. Well, here's where I'll depart from the theme that you get in this museum. I did my professional career in Hartford and was a member of the Hartford Medical Society, where we firmly believe that the true discoverer of anesthesia was Dr. Horace Wells, a dentist born in Hartford, Vermont, but practiced in Hartford, Connecticut, who discovered the use of ether for painless dentistry. And he was promoting it, and in fact, he taught Dr. William Morton, who you'll see on a board in that room, techniques as to how to administer anesthesia, chloroform and ether, nitrous oxide or laughing gas. And the Hartford Dental Society still has an invoice made out to Dr. Wells for $116 for instruction owed by Dr. William Morton. That bill had not been paid. And in today's money, it would be $4,500. So we take the belief that it's Horace Wells and not his disciple or his student, William Morton, who's the discoverer of anesthesia. Stedman is medically surveyed because of fatigue and exhaustion off of the Nahant and brought back to Boston, where he is placed in charge of the same naval hospital that his father was in charge of, and where Stedman, in fact, had been born. So he took over, I don't know if the whole hospital, or at least a ward, and here is Stedman giving instructions to one of his hospital stewards, taking the pulse of a sick sailor. So there were many naval hospitals, ships pass just below New Orleans, Key West, Philadelphia, Washington, New York, Boston. So there were a number of naval hospitals where sick and injured sailors would be brought. But there was a development during the Civil War that I want to highlight, is the USS Red Rover. And this would become the U.S. Navy's first hospital ship. Now, it had a career earlier as a Confederate supply ship that was captured at Island 10 and then put into service with the Western Sanitary Commission and with the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army controlled the ironclad fighting ships on the Mississippi and its tributaries until 1862, and then the Navy still maintained medical command, but Navy took over crewing the vessel. They re-outfitted it as state-of-the-art with surgical suites, ice house, brewery, bakery, sick wards, laundry. It was, as I said, staffed with some medical doctors, but also coming to it were Sisters of the Holy Cross from South Bend, Indiana, and also presenting and offering service are a number of self-emancipated women, African Americans, coming off of the plantations in the Tennessee, the Cumberland River, the Ohio, the Mississippi. And I would contend that they were the first Navy nurses because they weren't just hired out of petty funds. They were enlisted. They were enrolled on the ship's roster as ship's boys. So they were, in fact, within the Navy service. And too often we don't give names, but I want to read their names. Anne Bradford Stokes, or she enrolled as Anne Bradford. She would marry a African-American soldier, and she would go on, because of her documentation, she would go on in 1890 to get her own pension as serving in the Navy. And others, all self-emancipated. Ellen Campbell, Sarah Keno, Betsy Young, Margaret Jackson, Lorinda Jenkins, Nancy Buell, Sandy Sanford, Alice Kennedy. And I found these, I corroborated these based on the National Park Service's Soldiers and Sailors database. And all these women are enrolled on the rosters, quarterly rosters of the USS Red Rover. I want to doubly confirm this by going to the National Archives at some point. So, naval combat, infrequent. Major problem is boredom, monotony. When there's a fight, it's usually a draw, but it can be catastrophic for one or both of the sides. And the projectiles are much bigger than the mini balls that the soldiers are being injured by. And a ship is a complex target that surrounds a source of high heat and steam, and it's over an unforgiving surface, the deck, and water. So wounds, falls, often were more fatal than the initial injury. Examples of combat. This is the ship's duel between the USS Kearsarge and the raider Alabama, and just outside of French port of Cherbourg in August 1864. Kearsarge has been trying to track down the Alabama for years. Brings it to heel. The Alabama has to sortie to accept the challenge and is sunk. Another large battles were infrequent, but sometimes devastating to sides. And this is Admiral Farragut's fleet storming into Mobile Bay in August 1864. And here you see this monitor, the USS Tecumseh, has run into a mine, tipping it over and sinking it within seconds. 94 of its 115 men went down with the ship. They still maintained the attack with Farragut in the USS Hartford here, taking and capturing the CSS Ram, Tennessee, and reducing Fort Morgan and then Fort Gaines on the other side of Mobile Bay. And this is Farragut supposedly lashed to the rigging, is quoting saying, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." This is the USS Hartford. All right, total casualties. Total serving sailors and Marines, just over 130,000. Killed in action, 1.4%. And we'll juxtapose that with the Union Army's casualties. And of these, about a ninth are scalded to death and 1/9 are drowned. A third of those are drowned in the Tecumseh. Wounded in action, it's about almost the same as opposed to the Union Army, where wounds are much higher in percentage. And deaths from illness are also reduced from the Union Army's rolls. This compares the two. Deaths in battle, 1.4, as opposed to deaths in battle in the Union Army, 3.8. So just half. Deaths from disease, 2.1, juxtaposed to nearly 8% in the Union Army. Remember, bugs are killing more people in the Army than bullets are. So overall mortality rate, 3.5%, which is just under a third of the Army deaths. So compare and contrast. So much the same in the Navy versus the Army. The quality and selection of the doctors are much better in the Union Army after 1862, when governors set up commissions to aid in the selection of Union Army surgeons. Dr. Ira Spar of Connecticut is writing a book on Union states governors and their role in helping improve medical care. The illnesses seen and illness rates are somewhat comparable, maybe slightly less for sailors, much the same in medical and surgical treatments and in the use of hospitals. Contrasts. It's a different patient populations. We talked about childhood illnesses. I would submit there's fewer childhood illnesses among the sailors. They had it earlier before they enrolled. There's a lower incidence of dysentery and diarrhea because I believe the water sources for the Navy are better. There are also ability on some ships to desalinate water and make fresh water out of steam. Certainly lower battle injuries and mortality rates in the Navy, but if you're injured, the wounds can be more severe. Fewer women as caregivers, but we have the first enrolled nurses. I would submit the Christian Commission, the Sanitary Commission, the volunteer nurses like Cornelia Hancock, they weren't enrolled in the Army. They were paid as contractors. So Anne Bradford Stokes is the first enrolled nurse on the Red Rover. And if you're a newly enlisted recruit for the Navy and you go to training at Great Lakes, your first 3 days are spent in the USS Red Rover Clinic, where shots and examinations are done. So the Navy still maintains that tradition, that name. It still carries it on. It means something to them. So this is Stedman, the experienced, the veteran. And he's staffed after the Nahant, after he covers, to what he considers heaven on earth. The SS Circassian would be captured as a blockade runner and switched to a U.S. naval supply ship, and it would ply the waters from Boston and New York all the way to the Gulf, supplying the ships that were on station. And it was a seaworthy ship, and his sketch of what it would be like on grocery day for the flotillas going up to the Circassian and getting kegs and beef, sides of beef, and water. Very dynamic, lots of action, lots of motion in that picture. And in April of 1865, the Circassian returns to Boston, the war is over, and the Stedman is home. His greeting by his wife. I don't think we'll have time for me to go into Osgood Mason, but Osgood Mason was another surgeon, and I have quarterly reports on him. Maybe another time, or I can post them to you, Kyle, and we can circulate them. Let me back up. Post-war career, Stedman, he would resign in April. He would practice at Massachusetts General Hospital. He would become an important foe of incompetent midwives and quacks. He was a critic of arrogant and hesitant physicians, not someone you want to cross. And he would die in 1909. His sketches were found in the Boston collection, Boston Archives of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States in Boston, and published by Dan Hill out of Presidio Press in 1976. Do you have a copy of this, Kyle, in your library?
Yes, we do.
Okay, fine. I highly recommend it. You can probably find a good copy online for about between $10 and $25, and it's highly recommended if you want to see more of this. So, medical advances, much the same as in the Army. Certainly with Letterman, you've got evacuation, triage, mobile field hospitals, the first hospital ships, improved appreciation of sanitation, clean water, clean food, clean sick room, and a vast experience in the use of wound care, anesthesia, surgery, and increasing skepticism of heroic treatments. Begrudging acceptance of women in nursing, and then the vast collection of medical observations that luminaries like Osler would go to town on in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Well, thank you very much. Again, Civil War doctors, both Army and Navy, they did their best. Don't view them on what we know now about health and medicine and disease. View them how they did with what knowledge they had, what resources they had. You know, we can't be arrogant. Thank you very much. I'll take some questions.